Welcome to the Derek Loudermilk Show. This is episode 323 with Dawson Church. All right, today's guest is Dawson Church. He's the author of Mind to Matter, the astonishing science of how your brain creates material reality. And this happens to be the number one book that I read back in 2019. Every year I put together a list of the best books I read. Usually I read 100 books and give the top 10. And this was number one. And I am so thrilled to have him here on the podcast. That book has hundreds of basic scientific research that go into explaining how your consciousness creates reality. But Dawson is also known for his pioneering work with EFT, tapping or emotional freedom technique. And you're going to hear how he brought that to thousands of veterans before it was sort of officially part of the VA hospital system. He's also the creator of Eco Meditation, which is a meditation that he created out of thin air based on basic scientific research into physiological states. And he's going to talk about how he came up with that meditation. But basically what it does is it induces this state. It's a non-spiritual meditation, and it allows you to quickly sort of get to the same physiology of a 40-year Zen master. We're also going to talk about the importance of just mastering your own consciousness, your attention, your awareness. He says meditation is activism, and we talk a lot about the importance for extending your life, your daily outlook, how you process the world, and how you can train this stuff. We talk about flow states, solving problems, and creativity. There is just so much in here, and Dawson himself is just such a delight to talk to. He's got a fantastic laugh. He's very engaging. So this is such an epic interview. You're going to love it. Here is Dawson Church. Dawson Church, welcome to the podcast.
Derek, great to be here. Thank you.
I'm so excited. Your book, Mind to Matter, is one that I've recommended probably to more people in the last couple of years than any other book. So very fascinating stuff. Phenomenally well, in-depth researched, which is really important to me. Tying together the basic research and all the stuff that we don't understand in spirituality and metaphysics. And I'd love to start just by talking about this idea of the collective unconscious, and how with the pandemic and many of the other things that are happening right now, how we're all sort of experiencing the same things, maybe in a way that we haven't before. And I was just wondering if you could just comment on what that might mean for us as people and individuals.
Yeah. Well, we've always had a sense that there is something called the collective unconscious, and Carl Jung talked about that. And then in the 1950s, the great Jesuit philosopher Teilhard de Chardin talked about the psychosphere or the noosphere of the Earth. And so just like we have an atmosphere or a stratosphere around the planet, we also have the sum total of all consciousness and thought going on. And so we can't escape that. We have an individual local consciousness, and we're also embedded in this social consciousness. And so you'll feel these big waves of movement through that consciousness. And one which I remember really clearly, which maybe a little bit early for some people to recall, but when we went into the Iraq War in 2002, and we were moving that direction, I felt the whole consciousness of America shift from being really anti-war to being at least grudgingly pro-war, and the whole Congress eventually voted overwhelmingly to let the president declare war. And so that was like an example of a shift in consciousness. And then you feel these going through the mass consciousness. And the pandemic, for example, of early 2020, you felt this wave of hysteria, this wave of concern, this wave of anxiety, a wave of fear of the unknown, and you feel these things running through the mass consciousness. And if you aren't centered, if you don't have a real sense of who you are independent of that, then you get swept up in it. And I've been actually shocked, Derek, to see even members of my community, and these are people who meditate and they do EFT, tapping, they have various ways of centering themselves. And even when I do like big Zoom broadcasts and there are 1,000 people on the line from my community, I mean, often these people who you'd think would have that sense of anchoredness have been so influenced by those trends in the mass consciousness that they've lost their anchoring and they're really full of fear. So I think that the more the fear multiplies out there, the more vital it is that we have that strong anchor of who we are, that we know ourselves, that we know that, again, that above the, what was inscribed above the Oracle of Delphi, the Temple of Delphi in ancient Greece, know thyself. And you have to really know yourself at an organic level of your cells and your mind and your being. And then you're able to have that anchor. So when all of these big social currents happen, and there's talk about upheaval and pandemic and financial crash and all these things, that you are able to stay anchored and have a sense of self independent of those big currents in the mass consciousness.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about the Maharishi effect, right, with the meditators, and they were able to reduce violence around the world. And so
Yes.
It seems like that almost prescribes an obligation for people to center themselves, to know themselves, and to try to like calm down, and have an effect on the collective in that sense.
And also, I really emphasize in my books that you don't want to be withdrawing from the world. And the old model, like if you go back to medieval England, Germany, France, go back even earlier, go back to 2,000, 3,000 years ago, the whole idea was you couldn't do this. You couldn't reach these elevated states of consciousness and awareness and who you are in the marketplace, in the thrust and cut of everyday life. You had to get away from it. You had to join the convent. You had to go through these elaborate initiations, spend 10,000 hours, 20,000 hours, and eventually you were on the path and you were doing it in this monastery or in the desert or in a temple in the Himalayas. And so that's been the model. You just can't do it in everyday life. But what's happening now is so interesting to me because people are using these methods and doing these things, and they're executives and they're nurses and doctors and they're bus drivers and the school teachers, and they're doing things and they're bringing these states of consciousness into their everyday life. So that's the big difference I think that's happening now, is we're learning to reach these states and then we're learning to embody them right where we are. And that's a big shift where you don't have to go away someplace and do it independently of your real life. It is your real life.
Yeah. So I want to float an idea or a theory, and maybe we can bat it around a little bit. So my theory is that people look around the world and they see pollution or they see conflict or just things that we don't really like. We're like, how did that world get to be like this? And then you see people in fear or greed, profit driven, or something like that, and so all these sort of like ego, or, the negative things. And then we have this ability to get into these higher states of consciousness, into love and acceptance and compassion, and it seems like perhaps all the bad stuff can only happen when people are in these sort of lower states, and that if you are in a state of love and compassion, that somehow all that stuff that we don't like about the world, it would sort of just be incompatible and it just wouldn't happen. So yeah, I'm just curious if so I'm thinking about it like it just wouldn't be a resonance, like it just wouldn't be able to be a thing that somebody would do. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, in Mind to Matter, I talk about resonance. And so if you are fearful, for example, then you're in resonance with that great social energy of and stream in the psychosphere of fear. And so you're in resonance with it, and then you find things to be fearful of, and you solve one problem you're fearful of, and another one pops up right away. So it's fear that you're resonating with. And I talk a lot in Mind to Matter about the whole principle of resonance and about how it's found throughout nature. Just a very simple example is when you are in a room with several string instruments like a violin or a guitar, and somebody plays a note, all the strings of the other string instruments resonate with that note, even though they aren't being plucked. That's just what resonance does. In one image in Mind to Matter, I have an image of 64 metronomes, and they're all totally out of phase. And then you watch them over the course of 3 minutes, they all entrain with each other through that principle of resonance. So yeah, you want to make sure you're resonating with ideas and beliefs and energies that are helpful to you, and you'll find as you shift your personal degree of resonance and the energy you're putting out, then you're playing a different note. And you start to find, for example, you're attracted to and you attract different people into your life. And so your friends start to change, and you'll find the ones that were in fear, maybe they'll start to move with you and maybe they won't. And eventually they'll find other people resonant with fear. But you find people resonant with love. And I just feel so lucky and happy to have met people like, Marianne Williamson and Tony Robbins and Jack Canfield and John Gray and all of these wonderful, Donna Eden, all these wonderful people I get to play with and interact with in my life. And I can tell you, they're resonating at this fabulous level of love. And so as you shift your resonance, you then attract people and circumstances that reflect your level of resonance. And you're also in resonance with all these other cycles going on, because as well as that great social psychosphere of fear, there's also the great social psychosphere of love. It's there. You just can't see it if you don't know it. And I have some wonderful examples in Mind to Matter of people who didn't see things that were right in front of them because they didn't believe them. And one example was a woman who, she came to see a friend of mine who, my friend was a clinical psychologist, and a famous psychologist called Pat Carrington. And this woman called Amy came to see Pat. And she said, I want a relationship. I'm 32 years old. I'm not getting any younger. I'd love to be married. I'd love to be with somebody. And so Pat said to her, well, make a list. Really use your mind. Make a list of everything you want in the ideal man. And so Amy made a list of 64 things she wanted in the ideal man.
Wow.
Pat helped her do that. But Amy had this really fixed belief in her mind that all the good men are taken. It was like a firm thing. She said, I met these guys, but then they turn out to betray me, disappoint me, and all the good men, they're already married. So Pat worked with Amy on changing that belief. All the good men are taken. And Amy's belief just began to crumble, and she became open to the possibilities. So in the next session, she ran into Pat's office full of excitement. These were the days you could still go and see your psychologist in his or her office. And so Amy ran into Pat's office and said, I've met this guy. He's fabulous. I've been on a couple of dates with him. And Pat said, well, how many of the 64 characteristics does he have? And Amy's been checking off her checklist. Well, she said about 52 of them, which is close enough for me. And to make a long story short, they eventually, Amy did get married to this guy. And Pat then met them socially over the years and said they were one of the happiest and most successful, most functional couples she'd ever worked with. But Pat asked a critical question that session after Amy met her future husband. And she said to Amy, where did you meet him? And Amy said, oh, he works in the same office I work in. And Pat said, and just geographically in terms of office layout, how close is he to you? And Amy said, oh, he works 2 cubicles down from me. And Pat said, how long has he worked 2 cubicles down from you? And Amy said, for about 6 months. So the big point here, which I talk about in Mind to Matter a lot, is while Amy had the belief that all the good men are taken, she couldn't see her future husband 2 cubicles away from her for 6 months. Once she had released that core belief, she saw what was in front of her. And so I talk about it in Mind to Matter over and over again is the whole idea that you'll believe it when you see it has got the cart and the horse in the opposite configuration. You need to believe it. And that strength of belief will create neural pathways in your brain that will allow you to then see it. So belief comes first. It's shifting your belief, attuning to love, attuning to gratitude, attuning to well-being, attuning to prosperity. You do that in the midst of adverse circumstances, and you build those neural circuits in your brain. You then attract the people, the circumstances, your life starts to change, and then your external world becomes a reflection of your internal belief system.
Wow, that's a fantastic story. And I'd love to follow it up with a quick little personal story. I met my wife in very similar circumstances. We lived in this very small expat community in Bali, Indonesia, and we had hundreds of friends in common. So there was like no way we shouldn't have known each other, but we lived in the same place for a year, never knowing each other. And then once we had sort of both cleaned up previous relationships and come to a place where we were solid in our own identities and all that stuff, then we met and things went really fast. So that's
Love it.
phenomenal.
Wonderful. Yeah, at the right time, in the universe's timing.
Yeah. So before we started recording, you were talking about the concepts of some of these amazing meditators you've come across and the brain maps and brain waves. And we actually recently had James Hart on the show talking about brain waves and some of his work he does with Biocybernaut Institute. But I'd love for you to sort of share what you're learning, because it sounds like this is something that still you're actively thinking about right now. So I'd love for you just to peer inside how you're thinking about this.
Well, I'll tell you that I'll answer in kind of a roundabout way, in that when I was 15 years old, I went to live on a spiritual community. And so we grew organic vegetables and we meditated and we learned the what's called the perennial philosophy behind every religion. We steeped ourselves in this. I took classes that were sometimes a month long, sometimes 3 months long, really immersing myself in all of this knowledge. But Derek, I couldn't relate to it on a body or feeling level. And like I look at the images of Ramakrishna, the great Indian saint, or Ramana Maharshi, and these were photographs from the late 1800s, or I look at the portrait of St. Francis of Assisi, blissed out, I mean, just totally, completely blissed out in one of his trances, or St. Teresa of Avila, or I'd read the work of Rumi or Hafiz, or one of the other great saints, and they were describing states of not just feeling a little bit happier, they were describing states of utter ecstasy. And I was so miserable as a teenager. I was so depressed. I was so anxious. I was suicidal most of the time. And that didn't change. I mean, I went through suicidal periods in my 20s, my 30s. And I really was so depressed, anxious, miserable, the after effects of PTSD in my childhood. I couldn't relate to those stories. But when I made the commitment to meditate daily, which I did when I was 45, that was 20 years ago, I found that very rapidly meditation began to shift my life. I then learned energy psychology, energy therapies. Those produced rapid resolution of all kinds of problems I'd had for a long time. I was suddenly happier, and with practice became super happy. And then you start to inhabit these states that the Rumis and the Hafizes do. You're just creating poetry in your mind. You're lost in the universe. You're hearing heavenly music. You're in these elevated emotional states. You're so happy, in fact, that when I have people do my meditations now, we have to spend the last few minutes just bringing them back down to earth, because they get so far out there into the cosmos that they can't really function without that. So I've been really looking now at these states and how we can induce them in people. And the cool thing about today is we now can park a St. Teresa of Avila or St. Francis or a Ramana Maharshi inside an MRI, because there are these Tibetan monks that have spent 10,000 hours in meditation and have these evolved minds and brains. We have these Franciscan nuns who've spent 25,000 hours in mystical adoration of Mother Mary or the divine. And so we can put them now in an MRI, we can hook them up to an EEG, and now we can take Rumi and Hafiz and St. Francis and St. Teresa, and we can read their brain waves, and we can map exactly which brain regions are active and which aren't. So it turns out that the average person has a lot of activity in what's called by neuroscientists the default mode network. And it's called the default mode network because that's the brain region set to which our brains default when we aren't actively doing a task. So when you aren't doing stuff, when you aren't like working on a spreadsheet, when you aren't writing a blog, when you aren't cooking a meal, when you aren't doing anything, your brain just drifts into this default mode network, and that is really unhappy. And that default mode network is highly focused on the bad stuff from the past and how bad stuff might happen in the future. And that the brain defaults to this because evolution just trained us to be very concerned about the tiger that almost ate us yesterday, the tiger that might spring tomorrow. So the brain defaults to ruminating on the bad stuff. And it's been called the brain's negativity bias by psychologists for almost a century. But now we can see that this happens to people, and we can read which brain regions are active. So those brain regions are highly active in the average person. And one giant study by Harvard shows that we spend about 47% of our lives in a state of negative thinking with the default mode network active. And
Wow.
so what these Tibetans do, what these Franciscan nuns do, is they close their eyes to meditate, and they shut down the default network in seconds. I mean, under a second for the highest adepts, under 5 minutes in some of the other advanced yogis, and other parts of their brain to do with happiness light up. And there's a part of the brain, very important part of the brain called the insula, sits right below the neocortex, and it connects the inside of our brain with the outside of our brain. And the insula is to do with pro-social activity. So it's feeling compassion, it's feeling love, it's feeling connection with other human beings, other animals, other species, the whole of life. And that part of the brain, the happy, compassionate, loving part of the brain in these adepts lights up. And so now we can read this brain function in these adepts. So what science is now letting us do is it's letting us actually peek into the brains of these people, and then we're now mapping how to train ordinary people to get there really, really fast, without the monastery, without 10,000 hours, without removing yourself from the world, without going on three-year retreats, which the Buddhists do. And so now we're training people to sit there in their office and just move into that state and then start their workday. So that's kind of the difference between 1,000 years ago and these great figures that I couldn't relate to when I was 15 years old. And now we can train people to do it very quickly because science has given us the background to read their brain states and then let people know how to move into those states at will.
Wow. And I know you're a big proponent of tapping one of the main researchers, and you've got your own, the eco meditation that you created. Is that what leads into these states, or is it something else?
Those are the two things. Eco meditation puts you there quickly. And eco meditation is a form of meditation I invented about 12, 15 years ago because it's purely physiological. It's not spiritual, it's not belief-based. It just breathe at this rate, relax this muscle, sit in this posture, just a whole bunch of physical things you do, but each one is based on a study or several studies, and they're shown to induce an alpha state in your brain, to relax your whole nervous system. So your parasympathetic relaxation nervous system is predominant. So these mechanical things you do put you in heart coherence, and then you're in this very, very deep, but very, very, very alert state. And so eco meditation is the thing that I recommend everybody do as a starter meditation. If you're an experienced meditator, you may not need it, but if you're either a novice meditator or a meditator who's had a hard time meditating, I recommend it. Like I had people in a meditation workshop, a virtual one a few weeks back, and several of them who've been meditating for many years said they got much deeper doing that process. So that's what I recommend people do for 15 to 30 minutes every day. You don't need an hour. You certainly don't need 5 hours, but it's helpful to do it for at least 15, better to do it for 30 minutes, and some days maybe do an hour. So really have that hour. And what that does is it creates a baseline of well-being. You train your brain to be in these states, and then your brain can return there very quickly and easily after you've learned to do that. But what's going to happen next in your day? Here you are, you start a little peaceful and you feel great, and then you open your email inbox, you look at the news.
Somebody wants something from you.
You don't feel so great anymore. You've got a client who's pissed off about something. You've got a team member. Like this last week, we had somebody who was overcharging us on Upwork and billing us for work he wasn't doing. And it's like, so that just the stuff. My wife said, Dawson, don't you get mad about that when the guy overbills you? And I said, it's just part of having a business. We noticed and we shut off his account. And but there's this stuff every day. What do you do then? Well, I can't say then 10:30 in the morning, I'm going to go meditate again for an hour to get back there. That's where EFT comes along, because EFT takes under a minute to do this very brief acupuncture-based routine where you simply tap on a series of 13 acupuncture points. And just that acupuncture tapping, acupressure, is enough usually to very quickly dissipate your stress, and then you feel fine again. So those are the two methods I think are foundational. There are about 30 methods in Mind to Matter that I recommend you play around with. Like there's a study was published recently showing that being in nature, just time in nature, just going and hanging out in the woods, especially barefoot, so you have contact with the earth and you're grounding yourself on the planet, is producing an epigenetic effect in your body. It's literally turning stress genes off and turning immunity and inflammation genes on. So literal epigenetic effects from time in nature. So I have 30 different things, 30 things that in Mind to Matter I recommend you just try, experiment with that. If you're feeling low, are you spending enough time in nature? This particular study actually was done not with people in the woods, it was with people in urban green spaces. And just being, if you're in the middle of Manhattan, there is a church called the Little Church around the corner on 30th Street. And you go there, they have a beautiful garden. Just go walk in the garden for 5 minutes. It's going to change your gene expression. So there are 30 practices like that you do. Foundational is that initial start to your day with meditation, and then a stress reduction technique like EFT for during the day. And then make sure you also play around with other things, Tai Chi, Qigong, yoga, spiritual reading, spiritual books, elevated emotional people. There are a lot of other things you can do, but those two are the basics.
Yeah, wonderful. And I'd love if you could share a little bit about, you said you invented the meditation, and could you talk about that process of, piecing together what you knew about the research, and then how did you actually create the meditation?
Oh, Derek, I have something I've been wanting to show everyone for a long time. This is being a gold medal winner.
Hey.
And I was the gold medal winner for the world's worst meditator.
Okay.
I would easily win the world's worst meditator award, because the spiritual teacher when I was 15 years old said, close your eyes. There's two things you have to do to meditate. One, close your eyes. Now that I could do. Number two, still your mind. That I've never been able to do. It's an absurd instruction, because the mind is not designed to be still. I mean, think about the brain and the mind, and think of your ancestors trying to survive after the last ice age. And the ice is retreating from the ice shelves in Europe 30,000 years ago, and suddenly there are all these groups vying for resources. There are Neanderthals are still around, and all these tribes trying to compete for the stuff, animals out there to get you. And the last thing you want to do is have a mind that is still, because if you did, you got eaten. So the mind is designed to get still. And so I spent years trying to meditate and not being very successful at it. And eventually I also was talking at a conference to Roland McCraty, who's the chief of research at HeartMath. And he said that we've found that when we hook meditators up to a heart coherence monitor, that when they meditate, they drop out of heart coherence. Now, heart coherence is a highly desirable state, and they can train people to get into heart coherence. But he said that meditators drop out. Now, I didn't believe him. I thought it can't possibly be true. So being a researcher, got my heart coherence kit, my computer, and hooked up a meditator. And then I said, okay, meditate. And sure enough, he dropped out of heart coherence. So I did that a few times and realized that people are dropping out of heart coherence. They aren't able to still their minds. What do they do? So I looked at the research into simple physiological cues you can do that do not require believing anything or stilling your mind. One very simple one is if you relax your tongue on the floor of your mouth, because our tongues are usually tense and often are on the top of our mouths. But if you relax your tongue, there's a nerve called the hypoglossal nerve that runs through the center of your tongue, and it connects with your vagus nerve. And when you relax the vagus nerve, when you tell the vagus nerve you're relaxed, it sends a signal throughout your whole body and dials up your parasympathetic relaxation response. And it's as simple as relaxing your tongue. Another thing you do is you breathe in a certain rhythm that puts you in heart coherence. Then you go to deep heart coherence. So I just strung all of these favorite things together. I was like a little boy in an ice cream store, and they have Rocky Road, and they have vanilla fudge, and then they have strawberry, and then they have Neapolitan. And I said, I want an ice cream cone with all the flavors stacked on top of each other.
Yeah.
And so I stacked 7 of them on top of each other, called it Eco Meditation, stuck it up on the web. And my webmaster came to me like 5 years ago and said, Dawson, that crummy page on Eco Meditation, just a primitive page sitting up there on the web, we're getting 20,000 visitors a month. We were fighting this thing. We aren't marketing it. We aren't, we haven't even spell checked it. I mean, so that's when we got serious. I began to research Eco Meditation. And in this stunning piece of research that just finished at Bond University, these neuroscientists looked at people doing this for 30 days. So the design was a randomized controlled trial, and I've been involved in dozens of randomized controlled trials over the last 20 years. And this particular one, though, was a really ambitious one because it was using MRIs. And so we had these novices, most of them didn't meditate, didn't know anything about meditation, come and get an MRI at Bond. And then after that, they spent 4 weeks listening to a 22-minute Eco Meditation track. The control group got mindful breathing. They came back into the university imaging lab after that, did a second MRI, and the neuroscientists reading the results, looking at the composite effects of the Eco Meditation group, were stunned. Nothing much happened for the control group, but the Eco Meditation group, we saw the same pattern of brain activity as those 10,000-hour Tibetan monks. A shutdown in the default mode network. I mean, it just went dark, just turned off. And high activity in both the left and right hemispheres in the insula, that part of the brain to do with love, compassion, and happiness. So these people were rewiring their brains, and it didn't take 10,000 hours. It took 22 minutes a day for 1 month using Eco Meditation. So that's the beauty of science. Science is giving us now these tools to allow people to acquire these states, practice them, and then produce very rapid brain remodeling as a result.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about science. And I think traditionally science has tried to sort of isolate something to be able to study it. And in your book, you talk about the effect of our thoughts and intention and consciousness on the results of experiments. I think a popular one would be the double slit experiment, but that perhaps fundamentally all of science is being influenced by the researchers and by what we want to discover or find out. And that almost sort of shakes up science to its fundamental level. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Like in the behavioral sciences, like in psychology, sociology, we're usually having a design where there's blinding so that the researchers don't know who's in which group. And we can even have double blinding in some studies. They're randomized. People go in either one group or a control group. And so we use these protocols in the behavioral sciences. In the physical sciences, like chemistry and physics, there's hardly ever a control group. And so we don't know how much the observer effect is having on the results of the experiment. But I tell one funny story in Mind to Matter about a lab at MIT where these grad students have to learn to precipitate sodium crystals out of supersaturated solution. And it's also super hard to do. And so usually they have many, many failed attempts. And then the head of the lab told me that one new graduate student assistant came in, and he knew that they had to do this experiment. So he just went into the lab on his very first day there, and he precipitated sodium crystals out of the supersaturated solution. And she came in later and saw his results and said, "How did you do that?" And he said, "Well, I know that's one of the protocols here in the lab. I just, I knew we had to do it. I just came in here and did it." He hadn't got the memo that it was very, very hard to do. So without that belief, he just walked in there and did it. So how many experiments are being affected by the observer effect? So in Mind to Matter, I show there are 4 fundamental forces of physics, and I won't get all technical about what they are, but there's evidence showing that human intention affects all four forces. And I'll mention just one study by a close friend of mine called Bill Bankston, who's a remarkable healer. He has this healing technique, and purely through mental activity, he can produce extraordinary healings in both people and animals. And there have been more than a dozen randomized controlled trials of his method called cycling. And so this particular study was a remote healing study. And there were two groups of mice, and these mice in these experimental protocols, these mice have cancer, uterine cancer, and their tumors get large, and then eventually they die. And so there was one, and so now there are many studies of Bill who's sending healing to the mice, and the mice recover. But in this particular study, Bill was asked to send healing to one group of mice in a green room in one building on a campus that was distant from him, and not send healing to a second group of mice in a blue room that was in a different building, different lab. So for 3 weeks, he sent healing only to the mice in the green room, not to the mice in the blue room. And predictably, the mice did recover. But what also these researchers had done is they planted a device below each cage of mice that measured the electromagnetic field in the room. Now, this should have been constant. This should have been absolutely unchanging. And Bill was told to send that healing energy to the mice in the green room at random times of the day that Bill didn't know. He would just get a signal on his cell phone, send healing energy now. So we do that for about 20 minutes. When they looked at these random intervals, they found that the measuring device measuring the electromagnetic energy in the room had changed by about 20% only at those times when Bill had sent healing intention to the mice, and only in the green room. So here, one human being is able to affect one of the four fundamental forces of physics. And I can give you a whole bunch of other studies as well that are showing that, like water, we literally are able to take the water molecule, the simple H2O molecule, one big oxygen atom, two little hydrogens. When people bless their water, when they have healing intentions, that they then hold the water in, the bonding angle between the two hydrogens and the oxygen shortens, becomes less. So literally, we're producing molecular change through human intention. This is just a stunning, I'm getting chills actually, Derek, as I'm saying this. I mean, the idea that we can literally change molecules in the external world around us by our consciousness is remarkable.
And does the changing angle of the water molecule, does that confer some health benefits, or do we know what that might do?
Big time. In a whole long series of experiments done by Bernard Grad at McGill University, and also then replicated by other people as recently as last year, when they take that water that has had the intentions or the blessing that has been placed into it, because they're looking for a medium. How do you bottle this stuff?
Yeah.
So to speak, how do you make this available to people widely? And so they're looking for a medium of transmission. And what they've done in a whole series of experiments over the last 50 years, where they'll take two groups of seeds and they'll germinate them, and sometimes they'll grow the plants to maturity. And they find that in the samples of seeds that are watered with that blessed intentional water, the more those seeds germinate than in the other group, and those plants then grow higher and bigger. And in one very recent experiment, they could actually measure the chlorophyll content. The chlorophyll content was much higher in that group of seeds that was watered with the blessed water. So absolutely, the changing living biological organisms like seeds and plants.
Wow. Let me just show you my water bottle here. I have a little note to say thank you for sustaining my life. So I just say thank you to my water. I'm curious about your own, what do you do to your water? What do you say or think?
Well, when I read that study, I got serious about Thanksgiving and blessing. So my wife and I sit down to eat usually now, or like when we have Thanksgiving, we had a whole bunch of family over, we sit down and we just hold our hands out, or we hold hands with each other, and we bless our food. I also bless my supplements. I take a bunch of supplements every day, and I literally hold my hands around them. I bless them. Do I have any proof that it's improving them or changing them? I don't. But it is having a placebo effect on me and on my consciousness. So I'm imagining I'm eating blessed food or taking blessed supplements. And so that is going to affect me psychologically, regardless of whether I'm changing the molecular composition of the food. So that's one thing that the science has led me to do. The other, the other thing that the science has made me aware of is the immense power of positive and negative thinking. And I just want to really, for those of you who are listening, I want to really hammer this point home. Your negative thinking is not without consequence, and your positive thinking is not without consequence. And one of the consequences is things like telomere length, stem cell production, beta amyloid plaques in the brain. In a study published recently, the researchers looked at all the risk factors for Alzheimer's and the deposit of those Alzheimer's beta amyloid plaques in the brain. So they looked at all the lifestyle factors, all the dietary factors, exercise factors, risky behavior factors, and they matched them all up with the amount of beta amyloid plaques developing in the brains of these subjects. And they found that of all of those things that affect the deposit of beta amyloid plaques in the brain, one thing was more influential than all the other things. And that one thing was negative thinking. That negative thinkers had higher amounts of beta amyloid plaques in their brains, and the relationship was scaled. Now, this is really important. Wow. Scaling just means when one thing gets bigger, something else gets bigger. And when negative thinking increased, beta amyloid plaques increased. In other words, negative thinking was associated with beta amyloid plaques, and more negative thinking was associated with more beta amyloid plaques. And so that little thought you have, I'm just going to complain about my stock portfolio going down. I'm going to complain about, I didn't buy that stock that I wish I had now because it went up. My wife has this irritating habit. Let me tell you all about it. My teenage son, oh boy, God, my job, my supervisor, my blah, 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 my body. I try to do this thing with my body, and my default mode network, cranking away 47% of the time, negative thinking. And just think now, just reflect on that deposit of beta amyloid plaques in the brain. That's the momentary effect of those individual, today, negative thoughts. So you extrapolate that out 5, 10, 15, 20 years. One other study, a big 30-year study of mood and personality, found that optimists, people with a positive explanatory framework about the world, are 60% more likely to reach the age of 85 than pessimists. And once they do, they live 10 years longer on average. 10 years longer, influenced and associated with their thinking. So you can't afford one negative thought. That complaint you're about to make, that complaint you're used to making, tap, meditate, go see a therapist. We have a whole new app called Tapping Place, and you can do video sessions with a trained clinical EFT practitioner there, and just tap it away right away. Get rid of that negative thought just like that. If you let yourself stay in that negative thinking, it's producing a reduction in stem cells, a shortening in your telomeres. I'm just going to assume that people on your show know what those things are, and the deposit of beta amyloid plaques in your brain. So all kinds of health effects in the moment, which accumulate collectively in that 10-year shorter lifespan. So in the words of Peter McWilliams, you can't afford the luxury of one single negative thought.
Yeah, wow. I hope people that this lands for people, because going back to the beginning of our conversation, I think if you can eliminate the negative thoughts, then your actions and your identity and everything else associated with that changes too. And it's such a knock-on effect, a domino effect when you can do that.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's you talked about the change in the electromagnetic and sort of the field that Bankston was sending to these different rooms. And I think there's a quote of Tesla where it's like you should be thinking about fields and resonance and vibration.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could just talk about how thinking about fields is going to be important, or is now sort of like changing the way we look at the world.
Yeah, and a lot of fields are newly discovered and not yet thoroughly researched. And like, for example, I heard a lot of people in the 80s and even in the 90s and after talk about subtle energy. I actually don't like that term, subtle energy, because it implies there's subtle energy, this magical stuff going on out there. And, to say a Native American shaman in 1000 AD, a compass would have looked like magic. And magic is just something we don't understand yet. And science takes a while to explain these things. So there are all these fields, and we tend to believe very much in the medicine that we can see and touch and taste and get prescribed by our doctor. And we have very little appreciation for that negative thought and what that's doing to our body, or energy medicine. There's a whole branch of energy medicine, energy psychology. We have a big training program. We train hundreds of people every year in these techniques, and energy has this direct effect on our cells and on the world around us. And so there are these fields that we are participating in and we're creating and influencing. And in Mind to Matter, I talk about how the brain is not a physical thing that generates consciousness. It's much more like a receiver of consciousness from information fields, and then a transducer of that information into the world around us that it actually is literally creating all the time. So these fields are ever present. And we often will, when we're sick, for example, we'll go to the doctor and we'll get a pill, we'll get a prescription, we'll want to get a surgery perhaps, and people don't appreciate the importance of energy. But if you look, for example, there's this one story in Mind to Matter about a woman who I interviewed who'd had stage 4 uterine cancer. And the cancer had spread all throughout her body. She was terminal. She was told that her life expectancy was just a few months. And she said, I don't want to get chemotherapy and radiation. I'm already going to die. I'll just die horribly if I get the conventional treatment. I want to just go home and have the best few months of my life, loving myself. And so she went home and didn't get any treatment. She began to take baths and just imagine these healing stars glittering through her body. Began to take long walks in the redwoods of Northern California where she lived. And 6 months went by, and she was supposed to be dead, and she felt great. Went back in the hospital, and there was not one trace of cancer in her body. And so you hear stories like this, not just cancer, but many different diseases, that people use energy and thought and consciousness, and suddenly their lives begin to change. So there are these fields, and you can start to use them for your own healing. And I talk in Mind to Matter in chapter 1, and also in the final chapter, chapter 7, about non-local mind. And that's the place where St. Francis and Rumi and Ramakrishna and all these great saints go to. And they're letting go of their fixation on their local self, and they're tuning into these great universal non-local energy fields. And that's where ecstasy is found, that's where love is found, compassion and wisdom. Napoleon Hill talked about this a lot in Think and Grow Rich. He called this his invisible council, and he'd imagined himself around a council table with Thomas Jefferson and all of these saints and mystics and great figures from history, and he'd sit around his imaginary table there, and he'd be in non-local mind, and he said, I can't solve these problems at the level of my ordinary consciousness. I have to move and have a communion with my invisible counselors. And so he's literally moving into this non-local state, downloading this amazing information to his local awareness. So you want to be aware of these fields for your own healing and for your own well-being. And that's the practice every day. You let go for a while of functioning at the local level. Your default mode network goes quiet. Your insula lights up. You're in bliss. You're feeling all these wonderful neurochemicals flowing through your body. Serotonin, dopamine, beta endorphin, anandamide, the bliss molecule, all of these wonderful neurochemicals flowing through your brain, through your body. You feel just great. And then once you've used this time to merge with those non-local fields, you then start your day. And the cool thing about you starting your day then is I quote several studies in Mind to Matter about productivity. And one of them shows that when you're in a flow state, the flow states you induce by meditation, you then are 5 times as productive as you normally would be. Another study, really interesting study by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Agency, showed that people became 490% better, almost 5 times as good, at solving complicated problems. And there are complex problems we have to solve. Some problems are easy, but there's also some problems where there's no clear answer. How do you solve those? Well, your ability to solve them gets 490% better when you're in those elevated emotional states. So you aren't just feeling better during meditation and after meditation, you then go and have this problem in your business, or you have this insoluble issue in your family, or you have this problem in your community that you have to try and deal with a lot of different stakeholders. How do you deal with these problems? Well, what you do is you go meditate. You get 5 times as smart. You then apply that ability to your life, and you again are much more productive and much more able to cope with whatever the world throws at you. So this isn't just making us better at feeling good, it's making us better at what we do in the world. I'll just give you one little example of that in my own life. 2004, 2005, we were presenting EFT to the US Veterans Administration, the VA, because the first studies were coming up and the first case history showing that EFT is super effective for solving PTSD. And we had the first batch of warriors coming back from Iraq with PTSD, coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq with PTSD. Yeah. So we had this surge of people coming back from battle with PTSD. We had this really effective treatment of PTSD. We tried to get that into the VA, and we just got all the doors slammed in our faces. I literally went to Washington, D.C. once to present to a veterans group, veterans hospital, and just hours before our presentation, the chief psychiatrist said, "This tapping on acupuncture points, energy therapies, it's nonsense," and he canceled the presentation. So that happened for many, many years. Eric Shinseki was the Secretary of Veterans Affairs back then. We had a congressman writing to him saying, "Look at these therapies." He just wrote back saying, "No way." So we got all these doors slammed in our faces, and I just kept believing that it was going to happen. So eventually, I got invited to testify before the House Armed Services Committee, and then before the House Homeland Security Committee. And so things began to happen there. And eventually in 2017, the VA actually approved EFT as a therapy. But in the meantime, we began to treat veterans through a private organization called the Veteran Stress Project. And by the time we finally got approval by the VA 10 years later, we had treated 21,000 veterans free of charge. So you don't just disappear into this cloud cuckoo land where you feel just great and, oh, I'm feeling at peace with the universe and all is well. You come down to earth and you do stuff, like you go testify before Congress. You start a nonprofit. You start to get these therapies to victims of sexual violence, to refugees, to veterans, and you start to make a difference in the world, and you make a much bigger difference in the world than you otherwise would. So this is activism, and we are better activists, and we need to be better activists to solve today's problems. So that's what the magic of being part of those big energy fields and shifting energy does in a practical sense in your everyday life.
Well, Dawson, I just want to acknowledge you for being, an activist, for, stepping up and helping so many veterans and all these things. And I also want to acknowledge you're such an expert at weaving in these examples and stories. Like you'll tell us the fundamental research and then you'll give an example. And I think that's one of the things you do really well, is just bring it home so it's concrete, which I really appreciate. Just 2 final questions. What would you like to see? Where's a gap in science that you would like to see filled? And then where can people find you? And we just have 1 minute left, so real quick.
Okay. Yeah, the gap in science right now is belief. We don't believe it's possible to heal. We don't believe it's possible for us to be super happy. In these studies of Tibetan monks, their happiness levels, as measured by brainwave activity, is 25 times that in terms of happiness of the average person. So that's a big gap in science. It's hard to convince people. There's a lot of skeptics who try and block energy therapies from getting into mainstream medicine. So that's one unfortunate gap there. In one study I collaborated on with some other great scientists, the researchers found that it takes 17 years for a therapy to be proven in the lab before it gets to the patient. And that's a long, long, long time. And 80% of them never get to the patient, only 20% do. So that's the problem we have in medicine. It's not friendly to innovation. And that's the problem we have to solve in science. And then just overcome the skepticism barrier. Believe your life can be better. Believe you can have a much higher level of ecstasy than you do. Believe that the Rumis and the Hafizes and the St. Catherines and St. Teresas, believe that can be you, because research shows that in just 30 days of doing an effective meditation, you can get to those places. And then to get a copy of Mind to Matter also has a lot of links at the end of each chapter, what we call the extended play resources. So there are free meditations there are free videos there are all kinds of free resources you get. So if you go to mindtomatter.com, you can get a copy of the book, and because the publisher gave us a really big bunch of the books at cost, they're actually available for free. Just pay shipping and handling. So mindtomatter.com, and then make sure you go to those resources at the end of each chapter and use the free meditations, use the free videos, because they really do change brain function, and they do it in 30 days. You'll start to feel how much happier and healthier you can be.
Fantastic. Dawson, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Jared, a pleasure, and thanks for your wonderful work.